You are looking at one of the grandest memories of my childhood, the Lewis and Clark Exposition in 1905, one of the greatest spectacles in American history. I was here many years ago, and my mother and father were two of the people that helped build this stump town we call Portland. They weren't celebrated like Lewis and Clark, but in a way, they and others like them endured just as long and arduous a journey to this remote, untouched valley. So instead of telling you the story of heroic men and expeditions, I would like to tell you about a smaller, more humble legacy of my family and my life in a community that celebrated that journey we all take together, as neighbors, as family, as friends throughout life. We did this through the symbol of one tiny flower. The rose has been cultivated and celebrated for millennia. The Egyptians grew roses in the Nile Delta, and Cleopatra was said to dip the sails of her ships in rose water so that it made the very wind itself heartsick. The Greek goddess Aphrodite chose the rose as her personal emblem. The Roman Empire knew and loved her well, writing of her medicinal properties, perfuming their rooms, and showering their streets with her petals. They grew in China, inspiring Confucius. In India, they floated each night in the reflecting pools of the Taj Mahal, and rose oil and scents permeated the air of the trading posts on the shores of North Africa. It was used to make perfume, wine, tea, to aid sleep and cure colds. The Crusades brought her to Western Europe, where she inspired and transformed every art form from literature to architecture. In the Middle Ages, the rosary became a symbol of meditation and prayer. The French made rose windows in their greatest cathedrals, convinced the light which shone through them could heal the sins of those that stood in it. It was inscribed on the ceilings of temples and meeting halls as a symbol of confidentiality and secrecy. Its beauty inspired painters and poets from Renoir, Van Gogh, Cézanne and Vermeer, to Homer, Eliot, Blake, and Shakespeare. A single flower, 35 million years old. Just as the rose has a story to tell of its travels and mark on history, so too do people and families. The history of nations is often distilled to great men and great battles, but the true nature of life, of how we arrived where we are, is not the story of a few people, but of many. Not the result of great events, but the efforts of day-to-day lives. To become closer to history, we must see it through the eyes of ordinary people. Ordinary people like my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, my mother. In 1845, on the banks of the Willamette River, in what was then called the Oregon Territory, two men stood looking at a piece of land they called the clearing. And that's all it was, a clearing in the immense forest that surrounded them on all sides. But they felt certain if they could bring ships down the river from points further north, the clearing would become a town that would attract merchants from throughout the region. And so Francis Pettygrove and Asa Lovejoy, in debate about what to name this site, left it up to the tossing of a penny, and it became Portland. 3 years later, and 5,000 miles away, it was a cold, crisp morning when my grandfather walked from his village on the Dutch coast to meet the ship that would take him and others to the New World. He remembered the people of the surrounding villages who came out, lining the shore, giving the departing what they could to comfort them on their long journey across the vast Atlantic Ocean. A wheel of cheese, a blanket, a book. They gave them messages and gifts for family members already in America. Some clutched tightly to envelopes with the address of a brother in New York, a cousin in Boston or Providence. They could not even picture these cities, but hoped to find a home, a job, a new life there. Who can imagine what my grandfather was thinking and feeling that morning? He was alone, and he was 14 years old. Arriving in America after a 4-week passage, my grandfather found himself in the teeming, chaotic streets of New York. Unable to speak English, he had to reinvent himself to survive. Like so many immigrants who have come to this country, he struggled for acceptance and worked hard for bad pay. He found help and charity from his fellow countrymen, who all did what they could to help one another. He made a living as a cobbler, working alongside Italian and Irish immigrants, and taught himself English by reading discarded newspapers. He met and married my grandmother, an Irish immigrant, in 1855. He was 19 and she was 17. 2 years later, my father was born, an American citizen, in their small tenement building in the Lower East Side. Life was hard. My grandfather's wage was barely enough to live on. He was struggling to get a foothold when, in 1861, everything changed. The United States, his adopted home, went to war with itself. My grandfather could read and write English well enough to understand what was going on. He didn't want to fight, but when the Union Army began offering men $300 to enlist, he couldn't refuse. The money would feed his wife and child, would offer them a chance to get ahead, perhaps even to save enough money to one day start his own business. These were his dreams as he went off to the battlefield. But fate is cruel. Though he returned unharmed after 1 year, my grandfather came back to find his wife horribly ill with tuberculosis, a sickness that spread rapidly through the crowded city slums and struck the poor in great numbers. On April 24th, 1865, the same day Lincoln's funeral train passed down Broadway, my grandmother died, leaving behind a widowed husband and a motherless child. Forthright and stubborn, my grandfather embarked on the second great journey of his life. Heading westward with the same determination he used to cross the Atlantic, he left New York to recreate himself again in California. Now, this was sometime after the gold rush of '49 set off a crazed exodus of prospectors, bankers, and shady characters to a small city called San Francisco. And in the 17 years since, the city had grown from a few miles of ramshackle buildings to a sprawling, bustling port, as diverse as New York, and alive all hours of the day and night. This was the West, the frontier. There was vice, gambling, lawlessness, debauchery. The streets were filled with men from every corner of America, Canada, Mexico, China, all chasing the same dream and the same dollar. It was, my father recalled, like an avalanche of everything. It was while looking for work that my grandfather first heard stories about the new 33rd state, Oregon. He heard about impassable mountains and cathedral-like forests, mild winters, and fertile soil that could grow anything. This was a place where a man could own land and make a stake for himself as a farmer, a logger, or a fisherman. Whatever he chose to do, there was an opportunity. And so, as quickly as they had arrived in San Francisco, they departed by ship up the Pacific coast to the state of Oregon, arriving at a notoriously dangerous shipping route called the Columbia Bar. moon's light, my father could see a crowd of salvagers and onlookers standing on the beach. The ship had been reduced to splinters. He and my grandfather swam to safety in the dark water, holding on to each other as they searched for the shore. Of the 40 men and women on the ship, they were 2 of the 8 people who survived. In 1851, Portland consisted of a dozen homes, 1 store, and a boarding house. The rest was a series of empty lots with tree stumps sitting on them. Stumptown, as it was nicknamed, was notoriously difficult to traverse. Its sidewalks were crude with mud so impassable that the territorial governor himself could not visit the city in its early days. But by the time my family arrived, gold and timber revenue had transformed Portland into a booming and chaotic port. The streets thronged with sailors and merchants and smelled of refuse. Not a single bridge spanned the river to connect the businesses on Portland's west side to the wharves and settlements on its east. But the city was growing fast. Ships lined the harbor. The warehouses on Front Street were built out over the river on stilts. And waves of immigrants were arriving to help build a new railroad, which would connect the fledgling city with the rest of the continent. But my grandfather longed for the peace and quiet of nature, and what he found in the hills outside the city was a natural beauty unlike anything he or my father had ever seen before. Towering trees, larger than a man could fathom, 15, 16 stories tall, that filled one with a sense of awe rivaling any church in the old world. Deep in the Terwilliger Hills, my grandfather began to clear land for a log cabin. My father helped fell trees and ran a trapline around the property to make sure there was always something to eat. It took months of back-breaking effort, but our family homestead was now standing. Grandfather began to cure and tan the hides of the animals they hunted and trapped, and realized he had a genuine gift for it. Through trial, error, and hard work, he began tanning his own leather and sending my father downtown to sell it. 10 years after arriving in Portland, my granddad had found a trade that could sustain him, over time passing more and more of the heavy work and profits on to his son. By his 20th birthday, my father was a successful merchant, well known in the streets of downtown. He was even selling leather further south in the Willamette Valley. It was one day, along that rickety plank road that ran between Portland and the farms of the Tualatin Valley, that my father met a gorgeous farmer's daughter, a native-born Oregonian, my mother. Family legend is that he asked her to marry him on the spot, and she laughed in his face. But no matter how it happened, they were married a short time after, in 1879. A year later, my sister was born. And in 1895, my brother was born. 3 years later, in 1898, I arrived. The city was changing. The Stark Street Ferry was finally outdone when they opened the Morrison Bridge in 1887. The toll for those on foot was a nickel, and they were allowed one sheep or hen at no extra charge. While my parents built a house in Southeast to raise our family, and as the city around us accelerated and grew faster and faster, my grandfather chose to live out his days in quiet solitude in the cabin he had built by hand 30 years before. He never chose another wife, and never spoke to his friends about his days in New York or the love he had lost. Before he died, in 1899, he held me in his lap and read to me from a book he had shipped to him all the way from Amsterdam.
Het zijn de onverwachte verrassingen in het leven, die de lange, gevaarlijke tochten de moeite waard maken.
He was the last one in our family to speak Dutch. Looking back, growing up at the turn of the century was like being let loose in a wonderland of new machines, costumes, and inventions. It seemed like every day there was something new. Electric lights, buildings, bridges, new stores, new wares. Out with the old and in with the new. I was just a kid, and it seemed like the world was young too, moving so fast we could hardly keep up. Downtown, the streets were a clanging mass of people, horses, streetcars, cable cars, hundreds of wagons, and thousands of bicycles. The harbor was packed with steamers and sailing ships. We had 4 bridges, ferries, and 22 trains a day arriving and departing from Union Depot. There were no street lights or traffic signals. It was chaotic and dangerous, and I loved it. Everywhere people were yelling out, selling filberts, selling apples, selling newspapers. And bands played in the forecourt of the grand Portland Hotel for people who sat across the street and listened for free. Even the occasional flood couldn't slow us down. They just build us makeshift rickety wood bridges, and we all clamor about going on with our business. People were catching salmon from their storefronts for dinner. We even had street lamps. At the time, Portland was one of only 4 cities in the United States that was fully electrified. I was in heaven, but the best was yet to come. Across town, engineers and architects had been working for years on a site where they were going to construct the greatest spectacle any of us had ever seen. A celebration of the 1805 Lewis and Clark expedition that would stage itself on the shores of the Willamette River, transforming what had been nothing but a swampy patch of marsh and pasture into a site worthy of a World's Fair that would rival any before it. President Theodore Roosevelt himself came to town and laid the cornerstone to start construction. Mayor Williams issued a statement to the city.
Weather-beaten and dingy houses should be painted, dilapidated buildings removed, old fences repaired, lawns and grounds cleaned up.
And another Portlander was thinking of a still grander vision to beautify the city. In 1900, Frederick Holman began a campaign to have every Portland resident plant roses for the centennial celebration. He worked tirelessly for his cause, writing an open call to the people of Portland in a 1901 newspaper article.
For obvious reasons, we cannot compete with San Francisco as the foggy or wicked city, with Tacoma as the sleepy or Sunday city, or with Seattle as the raw or hurrah city. But we can, if we will, give to Portland the name of the Rose City during and after the exposition of 1905.
Holman's goal was to plant 50 miles of roses, 1,000 roses in each mile. And it was a huge success. On June 3rd, more than 400,000 roses bloomed in the Lewis and Clark Exposition Auditorium. Opening weekend, expectant crowds filled the bridges heading into town, dressed in the height of fashion. There were bright lights, dazzling fountains, a huge lake, grand buildings, parades, 100-gun salutes, world-class attractions, and a brand new amusement park. Standing on the grand staircase, it was a sight to behold. It was as if the world came to Portland. Imagine, more than 2 million people celebrating in a city that only 50 years before had been nothing but a few shacks in the mud. But to me, nothing could outdo the forestry building, the greatest and grandest log cabin ever built, with dug fir trunks that reached hundreds of feet into the air. I will never forget standing in that grand space and realizing how small we all were. Long after the centennial crowds left, Frederick Holman's vision of the Rose City lived on. As a result of his efforts, roses were now blooming all over the city. Their elegance, fragrance, and beauty inspired a host of new and visionary civil servants to create public parks, gardens, and events that would make the flower the lasting symbol of the city. In 1888, a tough woman with progressive ideals founded the Portland Rose Society. Georgiana Pittick was a passionate rose enthusiast who loved her community. The wife of the first publisher of the Oregonian, she was dedicated to perpetuating the rose throughout the city. And the first Portland Rose exhibition ever was held in her private garden. Jessie Curry, a Rose Society president, doggedly pushed to designate Washington Park as a test garden for the American Rose Society. And generations hence, it has bloomed with hundreds of varieties of roses from around the world. By 1907, Mayor Harry Lane and others were dedicated to building on the success of the Lewis and Clark Exposition. But it was a newspaperman who had arrived from Denver only 3 years before that came up with the way to do it. His vision would unite the city in celebration and begin a legacy that would endure for 100 years.
My great-grandfather, John F. Carroll, started the Rose Festival, along with many others, but he was instrumental in getting it started in 1907. And he was very much a progressive and was interested in things related to improving Portland. And I think what I find inspirational about my great-grandfather is that when there was something that needed to be changed, that pride meant you didn't sit back and wait for someone else to do it, that you stepped up and took action yourself. And that's what I really admire about him, that he lived that.
With the announcement of the 1907 Rose Carnival and Fiesta, the entire city was galvanized into a frenzy of activity. There was only 5 weeks, and the festival organizers wanted a rose show, parades, auto races, baseball games, dances, and more. Local papers put out a call for businesses to decorate their storefronts and windows. And Chester Whitmore of the Festival Committee issued a formal call that every citizen of Portland should wear a rosebud each day until the festival closed to show their public spirit and patriotism. My older sister was one of the 125 women who volunteered to decorate floats and automobiles for the grand floral parade. And you know what? They didn't have to buy one single flower. The day before the parade, there was an appeal in the paper for the community to donate as many flowers as they could spare. By midday, the women were overwhelmed. Carnations, geraniums, sweet peas, Oregon grape, poppies, and thousands of roses from all the gardens of Portland arrived. People cut, wrapped, and handed flowers to trolley car conductors who delivered them for free to the staging area. At the Forestry Building, Mrs. C.R. Templeton was in charge of gathering roses for a floral show that would rival the Lewis and Clark Centennial just 2 years before.
The rose growers and amateur florists, as well as those who had only a modest little garden, helped us out wonderfully. So freely and unhesitatingly were the roses given that our work was lessened by half. The people gave not only their roses, but the best of them. And many of the choicest roses grown in the city, instead of being placed on exhibit in competition for the prizes, were turned over to us for mere decorations.
When it was finished, the Forestry Building was a magnificent sight. There were 200 varieties of roses represented, and an expert corps of judges inspected tens of thousands of Caroline Testu roses to find the finest dozen in the city. 2 Pacific warships dropped anchor in the harbor before opening day, and as the sailors stepped ashore at the Stark Street landing, they were immediately bombarded with roses. I joined huge crowds lined up for the auto races, and we were treated to a world record performance. But my brightest memory is of the grand floral parade, of standing along the route with my family and being awestruck at the sight of it all. Automobiles, floats, marching societies, tally-hos, carriages, saddle ponies, tandems, and driving carts, all covered head to toe with real flowers. Nothing like it had ever been done anywhere before.
100,000 people thronged the streets of Portland yesterday to pay tribute to the festive rose. These right loyal subjects of the Queen of all flowers craned, jostled, and crowded most earnestly for a full view of the most gorgeous and most lavish floral pageant that ever passed through the streets of a city in the Pacific Northwest.
Never before in the history of a city has such a pageant passed through the streets as was presented to people lining the curbs, filling the windows, and hanging to every vantage point along the route of the march. It is a fair suspicion that no city on the Pacific coast ever put up such a show, on such notice, of such genuine materials.
No other city in the world is peer to Portland as the home of the rose. It was an imposing spectacle rivaling, if not eclipsing, any similar parade witnessed upon this continent. Portland awoke to find herself famous, and all the people arose to exclaim, "Long live the Rose City."
But the question on everybody's mind was, would it ever happen again? When news came that a second Rose Festival was in the works, my heart leapt. But could the city ever top what we had already done? Everyone did their part to try. Like my older sister, I volunteered to help decorate autos and home fronts. I must have personally decorated over 50 automobiles, all makes and models, and I got an up-close look at those fascinating machines. Somehow their steely personalities would soften with every flower I attached. In those next 4 years, I got more and more involved. The crowds got bigger, and the fanfare more and more fantastic. One year, daredevil pilot Silas Christopherson flew off the roof of the Multnomah Hotel, dropping rose petals on the crowd from his biplane. For a young girl, Portland had become a cascade of merrymaking, unlike anything I could have imagined. But 2 years later, I learned my first lesson about life's other realities. On March 7th, 1910, my father fell asleep and never woke up. He had lived a long and successful life for a man of his upbringing, a first-generation American. But the decades of tireless work had taken their toll. As he lay in his coffin, I could see that he looked years older than he really was. He was a young man who died of old age. At 47, my mother was now a widow with 3 children and a large house to manage. My father was well respected, so friends and neighbors made sure we were looked after. We never missed a meal, and somehow the clothes got washed. But in those days, women were not taught how to fend for themselves. They were always meant to be in the care of their husbands. With my father's death, life's responsibilities fell hard on my mother's shoulders, and they quickly overwhelmed her. It was my older sister who watched over me and my brother, took on raising us, and who gave me a new model of what a woman could do for herself. She taught me that it was my duty to be educated and strong, and to expect life to throw me the same trials and hardships it throws on any man. My sister was independent, and she was fiery. When she told my mother she wasn't going to get married by choice, I thought lightning was going to strike our house. But as I watched and grew up alongside her, I began to realize how good it felt to speak my own mind, to raise my hand in school and try to outdo the boys at math and racing. We followed the work of Abigail Scott Duniway, the famous Oregon suffragist who fought with the legislature, published her own newspaper, and traveled the state to spread the word on women's rights. I remember the first suffrage march my sister took me to. I was only 12 at the time, and in my naivete, I thought at first that we were marching in the Rose Parade. I was waving to the men on the sidewalks, but they weren't waving back. People began to yell at us, and my sister held my hand tight as we walked through the streets. We marched forward until one woman began to speak, and everyone crowded around to listen. We prevailed. Not that day, but after decades of struggle and 5 defeats in the legislature, women won the right to vote in the state of Oregon, 5 years before the 19th Amendment. And at 80 years old, Abigail Scott Duniway was the first woman registered to vote in Multnomah County. You could sense it all around. Women no longer wanted to sit idly in parlors as if they were a decoration, or cook and tend house and raise children as if that was all they were capable of. And in those years, a new tradition began at the Rose Festival, the choosing of a queen, the Queen of Rosaria, who walked through the streets like royalty during the Rose Festivals. In 1917, the focus turned to my brother. At age 22, he joined the Oregon National Guard, the very first unit mobilized when the U.S. entered the Great War. Once again, the city came together, lining the streets, as my brother and hundreds of other young men marched, headed for the fronts of Europe. They canceled the Rose Festival the following year. But in 1919, my brother returned and marched down those same streets again as we all yelled victory. It was Armistice Day. World War I was over. The Rose Festival was back on, and the Roaring Twenties were just around the corner. What can I say? I had the good fortune of being born right alongside the 20th century. So as she hit her 20s, so did I. Out in the streets, brewers and bar owners begrudgingly poured out every last drop of alcohol into the sidewalks. But inside the downtown hotels, my girlfriends and I were having the time of our lives. You've heard of flappers, wild dancing, the Charleston? That was us. We danced till our legs were wet noodles. High times. And one night at the Governor, I was approached by a young, nervous fellow who said to me, "You're the wildest and most beautiful woman I've ever seen." I stared him down and replied, "How dare you speak to me that way? Don't you know I'm the Duchess of Salisbury?" I grabbed his hand, swung him around, and danced with him for hours. We got married later that year. For our honeymoon, my husband borrowed a car and drove us down the new Columbia River Highway into its vast gorge. In 1922, we had a son, my pride and joy. And before he was even a year old, I took him to his first Rose Parade. By 1925, I had 2 daughters. My life had changed so fast, it was hard to comprehend. But my children helped keep me busy. It was their turn to be wowed by the annual spectacle. It's strange getting older. You realize that you were once a child marching in the parade, and now you are cheering as your own kids clumsily stomp their way down the avenues. Time does pass, and it also changes moods. While the early 20s had been joyous and promising, the mid-20s seemed to signal hard times ahead. Timber mills were closing left and right, and my husband was constantly worried he would lose his job. In 1929, the stock market crashed. And by 1930, 80% of the mills in Portland had closed. Our worst fears had come true. My husband and other fellers had to travel farther and farther from home to find work. He was gone weeks at a time now, and the money he could send back was never quite enough. If the Depression taught me anything, it was to be grateful for what you did have, because no matter how hard it got, there were always folks worse off. Sullivan's Gulch became our Hooverville, with hundreds of families living in shacks. Soup and bread lines stretched for blocks downtown. One day, men and women bloodied their hands banging on the doors of the bank, screaming how they wanted their money. But the bank said if they opened up and gave people their due, the bank itself would have nothing and collapse. Farmers were hit even harder. At home, I went to work and did my best to teach my oldest son how to fix meals for his sisters. When I saw my husband, it was brief and we were both exhausted. But he gave me hope when he said that the federal government was going to start something called the Works Progress Administration to bring jobs to Oregon men. It wasn't long before he was off again, kissing me and our children goodbye, none of us knowing when we'd see each other. It makes you wonder how, amidst all that misery and want, the community could find the heart to continue putting on the Rose Festival. But we did. In '34, they began the junior parade and court, and all 3 of my kids got hooked, decorating their bikes and wagons to march in the parade. I was happy to see them forget our troubles for a little while, because one thing you never want to take away from your kids is their childhood. All across the state, FDR's New Deal programs were putting people like my husband to work. You may not know it, but it was the WPA and the CCC that dug all the hiking trails and built all the campgrounds that you use today. They fought forest fires, built Timberline Lodge, and Bonneville Dam, where my husband was working the day he died. When I got the news, I couldn't speak, I couldn't walk, and I couldn't eat. I know everyone lost a lot during those years, but losing my love was the last thing I expected. I was on my own, like my mother had been, a widow at 38. When President Roosevelt came to Oregon and dedicated the dam and Timberline, I couldn't bear to listen to it on the radio. I took any kind of work I could find. I was a seamstress, a cook, and a house cleaner. The wealthier families in my neighborhood knew I had 3 young ones, and I think the women of those houses pushed their husbands to hire me. It was never spoken, but when I met the eyes of those women, I knew they understood how much it meant to me. You have to understand, there was no Social Security then. If you fell through the cracks, no one caught you. So I worked as hard as I could. My kids were raising themselves more and more. I was horribly lonely in those years after my husband's death. And I suppose that's why I found myself volunteering again for the Rose Festival. I went to their office and asked if they needed help. They must have thought I was crazy, working on my time off when it looked like I hadn't had a good night's sleep in years. But volunteering for the festival sustained me. It gave me back a sense of belonging. So I kept coming back week after week, doing whatever I could to help out. And you know what? In 1939, they decided to hire me as their permanent secretary. I would stay there for the next 30 years. When I got to work that morning in December 1941, everyone in the office was crowded around the radio. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the president was asking Congress to declare war. In the blink of an eye, the world under our feet shifted again, spinning the country into a renewed sense of purpose and fervor. The dams built by WPA workers during the Depression were now sending electricity to aluminum plants working 24 hours a day to build ships and planes. Everything from food to gasoline was being rationed. And hundreds of thousands of young men, including my son, enlisted. The Rose Parade was canceled in those years, but the festival continued to draw the community together and was the biggest war bonds drive in the state. One year, Lana Turner came in from Hollywood. She was made a Rose Princess by the Rose Queen, visited soldiers and children in the hospital, and sold kisses to raise money for the war effort. The economic hardships of the last 12 years about faced with dizzying speed, and Portland's shipyards exploded with jobs. For the first time, housewives were called upon to take up factory jobs left by the men who had gone to fight. And an entire generation of women who had stayed at home now took up riveters, bandsaws, and hammers to build the ships and planes their sons and husbands needed overseas. I had a lot of respect for those women, and I felt proud of their accomplishments, knowing that just 25 years before they hadn't even been allowed to vote. But I also know how painful and scary it was having a child in the armed services, unable to tell from day to day where they were stationed and whether they were okay. My son was a Marine, and he had been sent to the South Pacific, where each tiny island under Japanese control had become a fight to the death. News was sparse. I got letters, but they always came weeks after he had written them. had to stop reading the newspapers because the numbers of casualties were more than I could bear. It was late in November 1943 when I saw the Western Union truck pull up outside my house. I knew what it meant. All us mothers did. The woman at my door handed me a telegram from the War Department that told me my son had been killed in action in the invasion of Tarawa. He was one of the 1,001 Marines who died in that battle, fighting to liberate an island smaller than New York's Central Park. They handed me a gold star to sew on my service flag in my window. It was my daughters and the women I worked with who took care of me. They brought me food and held me up. At my son's funeral, I was handed an American flag and told that a grateful nation thanked me for my sacrifice. My older sister, who had told me to be ready to weather the storms of life, had no idea how right she would be. I have no comprehension what it's like to fight in war. But I, and all the Gold Star mothers, know from the bottom of our hearts what it is like to suffer the effects of it. On August 15th, 1945, the war ended. People filled the streets in celebration. For those who did return, home was never the same again. The war brought tremendous changes to Portland. Racial exclusion and segregation had always been in practice in Oregon from its earliest days. The Native Americans faced near extermination. Chinese families had their houses burned. American citizens of Japanese descent were forcibly relocated after Pearl Harbor. And the state constitution excluded people of color from owning land or voting. In fact, before World War II, there were only about 2,000 blacks living in Portland. But by 1945, there were over 22,000. And most of them lived in a city called Vanport. Portland's shipyards needed workers, and soon an exodus of men and women from all across the country, black and white, arrived in Portland looking for jobs. Henry Kaiser bought the land south of his shipyards and hastily constructed a development to house the new wave of immigrants. It would grow in just a few years to become Oregon's second biggest city. In many ways, Vanport was full of the people Vancouver and Portland didn't want. Segregation was still a way of life. But Vanport was a multiracial and cultural mix of working-class families. They had fully integrated schools and the first black teachers in the state. But Vanport had been constructed in a vast floodplain, 30 feet below the Columbia River. On May 30th, 1948, the city of Vanport was completely washed away. It only took 90 minutes for the Columbia to erase the second largest city in the state. A debate raged in the Rose Festival office about whether or not the Rose Parade should even be put on. The scale of the tragedy was too great, people said. But I told them that this festival is about celebrating life. Life is tragic, and we can't control that fact. So why should we deny ourselves the small relief and joys we can bring to one another? The parade went on. It was in late '49 that my oldest daughter married a steelworker from the Willamette Iron shipyards. 1 year later, they had their first son, and now I was a grandmother, entering the second half of the new century. The '50s brought around another series of changes for me. My youngest daughter moved to Wisconsin and married a dairy farmer outside of Madison. My fear of commercial air travel never allowed me to visit her and the new family she created. I rarely saw her for the next 20 years. It was unfortunate, but I had to take care of my elderly mother, who was suffering from dementia. For 5 years, after every day of work, I would visit my mother at the senior center where she was being looked after. In those days, social workers were still naive, and it seemed to me that my mother was suffering more than she should have been. So I would visit her every day until her death in 1955. My mother could not remember her granddaughters and grandsons, and her final years left her unaware of the life she had already lived. This woman from a small farm in the Tualatin Valley probably never imagined the magnificent changes human society was about to experience. Her death came at an appropriate time, just like the oncoming of winter in November. I should say that it was in these years I began to develop on my own new programs for the Rose Festival. It's important to keep in mind that the Rose Festival is only as good as those who participate in it. The first generation of Rose Festival enthusiasts were aging, and it was important to me that the Rose Festival experience not disappear from their lives. I started creating special programs that would bring the princesses, rosarians, and talent acts to those who couldn't visit them. It provided a reminder about the warmth a community can create by reaching out to an elder soul that has been overlooked or forgotten. I found myself in the 1950s looking for an answer, some kind of deep spiritual meaning that had been taken away from me because of the death of my husband and son. I can honestly say that I never found that answer. I was a woman living with a broken heart. And my weekly visits with other Gold Star mothers helped me cope with my deep sadness. If it wasn't for the uplift that the Rose Festival brought me, I don't know what I would have done. But all my hard work to bring the Rose Festival to those who couldn't see it for themselves still exists today, still provides smiles to the forgotten and spiritually wounded. The 1960s was my final decade with the Rose Festival. I found an undeniable shift in both the personality and drive the Rose Festival presented. The next generation of youth was the largest in our nation's history, and they were bringing in new ideas so fast and furious I couldn't keep up. Many of my thoughts and ideas were outdated. I had a hard time relating to our new staff, our new president, and many of our new volunteers. I had morality issues with the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And my time as an aging secretary was coming to a close. Maybe I was a bitter old woman, lost to memories of a grand generation that seemingly had been forgotten. But I had already experienced every Rose Festival from its inception, so quite possibly I had an unrealistic viewpoint about the world and my changing community. But great things were happening in both tragic and remarkable circumstances. Civil rights were taking hold, reminding me of my sister and all the great women who fought for female equality. Long overdue, but people died for these basic truths. We should never forget that. I retired from the Portland Rose Festival in late 1969. 30 years of dedicated work and a lifetime of community service was at an end. It was uplifting, more so than I even thought it would be. After 61 Rose Fests, 58 grand floral parades, and a wealth of civic pride, my time as a Rose Festival secretary and volunteer was over. I was 71, and I found myself in the same position I was as a child. I was now a patron, a simple onlooker, completely removed from any internal workings from my beloved nonprofit. In these final years, I really enjoyed being a spectator. I was able to take my grandson and his sister to many of the parades and special events. My fondness for auto racing still had not ceased, and because of this, I was able to connect with my grandchildren on a very personal level. They loved the auto races as much as me, and always referred to me as Mama Bear. In my humble critique, I will have to say that the 1970s was an awkward decade for America, and it was reflected in the Rose Festival. It seemed to me that the organization had fallen on its face a few times. Just as I was having troubles connecting to the youth in the 1960s, the Rose Fest was having the same problem in the 70s. Maybe it was a lack of far-sighted volunteers or a complete disconnect from the local culture altogether. But for whatever reason, I winced more than a few times at the grand floral parade. The Mount St. Helens eruption was a fantastic event to behold. Gray snow in the form of ash rinsed across the neighborhoods of Portland, mucking everything it touched, damaging cars, their engines, killing lawns, and providing a terrible smell across the region. I had never seen anything like it. Nature is a powerful creature, and she will always let you know in a magnificent example. Just as the Vanport Flood risked the very celebration of the Rose Festival, the Great Eruption provided the same discourse. But somehow people pulled together and celebrated our lives just as we had done in 1948. I guess it was my nearsighted opinion that had placed a bitter pill in my mouth. But this was my own doing, and so the blame rests purely on my shoulders. I would work hard never to make the same mistake again. Losing pride in your community is a debilitating feeling. I can say this about the 1980s. It was one of the most uneventful and simple times in my entire life. There were no great family tragedies, no major health issues, and all my children and grandchildren were happy and strong. My generation was thinning away, and my friends passed frequently each year. But this didn't bother me. I was an old woman who had finally become comfortable with life and death. I still missed my son deeply, and my husband was never far from my heart. If my life and its dedication to the Rose Festival taught me anything, It was to be strong, to hold perseverance over loss, to seek help rather than to keep silent, to celebrate our lives, both living and deceased, to be proud of who you are and where you live. I most certainly lived in a very special time, in a very special place. On June 23rd, 1984, 2 weeks after the first great Indy races in Portland appeared, I went to sleep and never woke up. My life had ended at age 86. There was never a great book written about me, or any great legacy that I left behind. My time on this planet was quiet, humble, and tragic. But I survived, and somehow managed to get 86 fantastic years in Portland. But there's a funny thing that happens to you when you die. Your memories stop. And because of this, I can no longer continue the story about my life and my dedication to my community. This is the part where I acknowledge we are all watching a film, a collection of images that reflect my memories as I see them. It's not perfect, and it's not the complete story, but it's honest and genuine. I feel that this is the time where I hand the film to you, the community, the audience. You will finish this story. You are responsible for those you live with and live around you. It took my whole life to figure out what I'm about to say to you, and I hope that you listen closely. Love yourself. Love your neighbors. Love your family. Take pride in your community and work together to create a remarkable life experience. You only have one life on this planet, and it is best that we all celebrate together.
Only a rose I give you, only a song dying away, only a smile to keep in memory until we meet another day. Only a rose to whisper, blushing as roses do. I'll bring along a smile or a song for anyone, but only a rose for you.
Civic pride. It's taking care of the place and the people that have taken care of you. It's respecting your home and your community. It's giving back and remembering that everybody can do something to help somebody else.
The Rose Festival helped me appreciate a couple of things. One thing in particular is the role of women, young women, and what they can learn to do. And the other one is how important it is for education for young women. And one of the reasons when I was asked to participate as the 50th Queen this year was that I was told that they were concentrating on raising money for scholarships for young women to go to college, and I really like the idea of trying to help that.
What does the Rose Festival mean to you personally? You know, I've said this a lot, but Portland is really about people. You know, we have beautiful buildings, we have wonderful natural scenic areas around Portland and in Portland, but it's really about people. And I think what Rose Festival does is it brings out the best in people.
When I saw my first floral parade, I knew how special the Portland Rose Festival was, and then as I saw all the activities unfold over that 2, 3, 4 week period, I realized then what we have heard repeatedly over the years, that Portland is the host of one of the best civic celebrations in the world.
It's about becoming a better person and learning a lot about yourself through this experience. It's very locally based, it's very community oriented. This is about who you are, where you come from, and representing that.
To know that your efforts result in that. To see your work year-round come together in a community celebration where so many people are involved and part of it is the best part about my job.
It really makes me excited that I live in such a beautiful city, that the emblem of it is the rose, a flower that I just cherish.
I get very sad when I help people say, oh, I've never even been to the Rose Festival. I know nothing about it. I think they need to know because it's such a caring organization and we give so much back to this community.
So what do you see the future of the Rose Festival possibly being like?
Well, the future of the Rose Festival will depend on its ability to continue adapting to the times, to being relevant to the people that live in this community. It's a people event. And so if it ever stops being tied with the people, and I don't think that'll happen because they depend so much on volunteers, the people coming to Rose Festival, but if it should ever try to be something that doesn't represent the people of Portland, it'll go away and die.
Did you ever feel that great sensation of civic pride?
Oh, always. There was nothing like watching the junior parade come together when I was on the staff at the festival and seeing what seemed like a chaotic experience all of a sudden evolve into a parade that took off down the street and happened as it was supposed to be. It's that pride, that sense of accomplishment. Not like what I did, but what did we do? What did we do to help?
What do you see for Portland and for the Rose Festival in the future?
Portland's future, for the future of the Rose Festival, you know, I think we have a lot of questions to ask in terms of our future, and we have to get real serious and real creative about how we're going to answer them. But I really believe that a shift is about to happen, and it's one that we're really going to have to pay a lot of attention to if we want to preserve the livability of the city, the beauty of the city, and most importantly, the Portland Rose Festival and that rich tradition of what was created here.
What should the next generation of community leaders look towards?
Think long term. Don't just worry about what is happening today. My greatest concern is that people look at just today and they're not looking out as community leaders of what they want their city to look like in 20 or 30 years. What you want to do is to build a process in which people, when they go to the Rose Festival, when they're young, that they develop it as a family tradition and they do it year after year after year. But the only way you'll be successful with it, it isn't people my age telling the young people, you should like this. Bring them in, let them sit down and say, this is what we think you should bring down there.
There are probably hundreds of thousands of things that are unique about Portland. But I think that one of the things that stands out for anybody who's been involved in the Rose Festival or lived here is the civic pride. And I think Portlanders, no matter what their interest in, want to be successful within their city and their environment. And there's an awful lot of pride that exists here. I've been fortunate or unfortunate to live in a lot of places across the country, and never have I lived anywhere where the civic pride is as great as it is in Portland.
Do you think the Rose Festival represents coming together?
Absolutely. There's all religious groups involved. And they're not there to express their religious views. They're there to celebrate the health and so forth of the community, and the fact that the roses are coming up again, and life's going to be all right in Portland, Oregon.